Hey, what's up everybody? Today I wanted to talk a little bit about flat-wound strings on the bass. I know there are a lot of examples of this floating around the internet and on YouTube, but a lot of my students have never even felt flat-wound strings, so I wanted to give just a little primer, a little heads up of what they sound like and what the difference is, maybe the pros and cons of using flat-wound strings on a bass. As you can see, I have a Fender Precision bass, which is about as old school as it gets. It's totally passive, and you put flat wounds on that and that's going to give you super traditional tones. Now, the stigma has always been flat wounds sound dead, dull, too dark, no sustain. So I want to give a couple of playing examples of what flat wounds sound like. Here's volume and tone full up, a little blues bass line. So you can hear it definitely has a darker sound, but it's very punchy, and I like the way that it sits in a mix. It's depending on the style of music that you're playing. If you go back and listen to Pino Palladino, what he did with the John Mayer trio stuff, P-bass, flat wounds, super punchy, super apparent in the mix. Listen to even farther back, around the year 2000, with D'Angelo, he played also P-bass, flat wounds, that real neo-soul, super groovy stuff with Questlove on drums. Really cool tones, really cool playing. Check it out if you haven't heard it. And people say, well, that's great, but that's not the sound I'm going for. What does it sound like for brighter, more attacky stuff? So here's something with a pick, a good old classic bass line that I grew up with. Shout out to Jane's Addiction there, but you can hear, even with a pick, you can get some decently bright tones out of it. Now if I roll the tone on the P-bass back about halfway, back up, so you can see there's a little bit of variation there, and you do have some. Now these are new flat wounds, so I'll give you that. They will darken up a bit and get more punchy. Now the other thing is, people say, well, flat ones don't sustain well. I'll just fret a D here. I think that does pretty well for sustain. And you'll find different notes, just as with round wound strings, may sustain better or worse. So now, the other big thing is, what about slap tone? All right, now that, I'll give you, round wound is going to give you that sharper attack, that brighter sound. My idea of ideal slap tone is definitely a jazz bass. So P-bass, even with round wounds, is a little bit different for my taste, but it's done, it's a sound, and people do it. And it sounds great. I've heard several recordings that use it, and I like it. But for me, Marcus Miller is my ideal slap bass tone, which this is not going to sound like, but you'll get an idea of just maybe an option that you would have. So you can get away with it. You know, like I said, it's not going to be that Marcus jazz bass, sharp, bright attack, but it gives you some options. It sounds great in the high register. Again, I'll give you some examples. Here's tone all the way up. Let's roll it back a little bit. the heft, the girth, the beef that it has in the higher register. It doesn't sound wimpy. And I came up playing active basses. I've had many, I still do have some, and I like, for a large majority of things, I like them. Modulus was my go-to, and I still have a Modulus Vintage J, but I played their Quantum series for a long time. I had a Padula, really liked that bass, wish I hadn't sold it. But the thing that I always noticed was I'd play on the G string, and it sounded really thin. And I was like, why, when I play down here, sounded great, and the G always sounded thin. And then I picked up a P bass one day and played the G string, and I was like, this sounds like the string is 3 times the size it should be. I like having the girth, I guess is the best way to say it, and in the higher register, and those notes really stick out. You know, if you're playing a bass line and you want to jump up, it doesn't feel like the bottom just drops out, or it gets real zingy and you hear frets and stuff all over the place. So there's some pros for the Flatwounds, and honestly cons, the only thing I could think of is it is a lot tighter tension. So you put the same size strings on that you would in round wounds, your neck's going to pull forward a little bit, so you're going to have to adjust the truss rod. It's going to feel a little more tough to push down, but honestly I kind of like that, depending on the style of music I'm playing. You know, if I'm trying to play really, I don't know, upbeat jazz, then maybe I'd want a lower action, but I kind of like working with the bass a little bit, and I like the way that they feel. And you can dig in a little harder too with more tension. So that would be maybe a con if you're not used to that tight tension on a string. But I encourage you, try them out. They aren't cheap, depending on the kind that you get. I used Diodario Chromes for this, and a set of those for 4-string is about $40. So you're going to put some money into it, but if you try it and like it, these strings will last years and years. You won't have to replace them as often as round wounds. For me, I have one bass with round, one bass with flats at the moment, and it gives me some options. And like I said, I'll go back and forth because there's times where I want to hear round wounds and this for that real sharp attack. But go out and try it, see what you think, and as always, keep learning.